We're now going into our second session in our Transforming Technology piece. We've got one speaker and then a panel session that will then take us through to lunchtime. And the speaker is a pretty famous person around the globe. I mean, I was just telling Robert that in Australia I've had, because he's going to Australia after here, I've had all these people telling me how excited I should be because I'm going to get the chance to meet Robert in Australia. And I'm saying, well, I'm seeing him in Auckland on Monday. You know, just to prove that you're ahead of Australia. 2 hours. Well, 2 days in this case. Robert's going to talk to us about a few things, but I know some of the data that he uses. It just made me want to ask a question before he starts, and I hope this doesn't destroy it. We've got a few people who are using devices in the room, be they smartphones or tablets. I'm just wondering, and there's free Wi-Fi in the room. I'm just wanting to do a straw poll. How many of you are using the free Wi-Fi in the room right now? And how many of you are using 3G connection? Okay, as well. I think that might play into one of the parts of the data, but I'm not sure if he's using that piece of data. It's a really interesting one when you're talking about the future with high-speed broadband. So, look, without any further ado, Robert needs no other introduction than other to be told that Robert Pepper leads Cisco's global technology policy team, working with governments across the world, and he works with audiences in Auckland as well. Please welcome Robert Pepper.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate that. I'm not sure if famous. I think of myself as a recovering regulator. Right? I wake up every morning, look in the mirror, and say I'm a regulator, but I haven't regulated today. It's part of the 12-step program. Now, you know, I've been at Cisco now about 6 years after having left the FCC in Washington, where at the FCC, what I did was I led a very small strategy group. Right? There were about 16 of us versus 2,000 people at the rest of the commission. And we were looking at what was the future. So Gerd, I really enjoyed your talk. And I can tell you that regulators globally are sort of coping with these questions of what is convergence and what does it mean? And we'll maybe get into that also into the conversation. So I'm going to talk really about 4 things. One is work that we've done mapping what we call ICT ecosystems globally, and specifically look at New Zealand, where New Zealand falls on that. Second, consumers driving demand for broadband, based upon some work that we've done with something called the Visual Networking Index. And then I'll talk about data released less than a week ago, last Tuesday, in our latest study, which was the Mobile Visual Networking Index. And then talk about how we work globally with governments to develop strategies for going forward in that world. Well, let me just ask a question. How many people here know what a zettabyte is? Okay, there's 1, 2, 3, almost as few, and Gerd, of course. Actually, there are fewer people who know what a zettabyte is than we're using the 3G connection. Although, you know, you don't have to pay global mobile roaming rates or data rates for knowing what a zettabyte is. A zettabyte is a 10 to the 21st. It's a huge number. And we forecast that by 2015, the global internet actually is going to reach, across the internet, approximately a zettabyte a year of traffic. So, you know, 966 exabytes, you round it, it's a zettabyte. Why is that important? Well, first, it's 8 times more traffic than all IP traffic generated across the net in 2008, just to put that in perspective. And I'll come back to that and why it's important. But first, let me talk about this project we've done, this study looking at mapping ecosystems, what we call ICT ecosystems, and where New Zealand fits on that. And the punchline, by the way, is that it's very good news for New Zealand. So this is based on a study that we did for the first time for the World Economic Forum's Global Information Technology Report in 2008, and we've updated the data each year since. And what you can see here from the World Economics Forum Country Network Readiness Index, New Zealand has improved virtually each year. One year it went down, some years it stayed the same, but net, in terms of the net readiness index, right? New Zealand went from 2004 from 23rd in the world to 18th, right? So it's going in the right direction. And then what we've done is we've taken these data and we've built out a map based upon globally available information from the World Bank, the ITU, World Economic Forum, just standard data, built a model, and on the vertical axis, right, the y-axis, we have this ecosystem index that includes policies for ICT, market dynamism, business climate, how easy is it to develop a business generally, and then specifically things like competition and connectedness and teledensity in ICT. On the x-axis, it's the infrastructure. It's the network infrastructure of households with a PC, secure internet density, mobile subscriptions, availability of soft infrastructure, capabilities, training, scientists, engineers, et cetera. And we've mapped 110 countries. Now, not surprisingly, if you're in the lower left, right, you have a poor ecosystem. It's not causal. It's really too difficult to do that. But the correlation is poor ecosystem, poor infrastructure. This is, by the way, not broadband. I'll talk about broadband next. And if you're in the lower left, you have low broadband penetration and relatively high connectivity costs. If you're in the upper right, you have higher broadband penetration and lower connectivity costs. New Zealand does pretty well. I know that's going to surprise some of you because I've had conversations about the high price of broadband here. But again, this is not just about broadband. This is about the overall ICT ecosystem. So how does that compare to some other countries? Your neighbors, and then the G7. So New Zealand is up there with what other countries call aspirational countries, right? Other countries aspire to be where you are on this ICT ecosystem map. And again, we've updated this each year. So that's the good news. Now let's take a look at where New Zealand is in this zettabyte error, right? It's okay, but it's not as good as what I've just shown you. And that's really for the conversation for the rest of today and tomorrow. So the data here are based upon this Visual Networking Index study. We're now in our fifth year computing the study. And it looks globally at the consumption of data across networks, global networks and national networks. And through the models we've built and the network operators that we cooperate with, we're actually able to look at anonymized real traffic and the types of traffic. And what we've seen globally is that on a compounded annual growth basis, the traffic across the global internet is growing at a compounded annual growth rate of 32%. That's a lot. In New Zealand, it's actually growing faster than that. Now, what's interesting is that the forecast 2010, 2011, 12, 13, relatively slower incremental growth than later in this time series. And I think built into some of this is the later part of the time series takes into account some of the national plans with fiber. And I think there's some assumptions that this is actually going to work. If it doesn't, of course, there'll be a modification in the model. But again, we'll talk about that. The model's very dynamic, and each year we make modifications. So it's hard to remember that it was only 2 years ago, February 2010, that Apple announced the iPad. It wasn't available in the market until April of that year. So tablets, as we now know them, have only been around for about 22 months, right? And the forecast from 2011, which incorporated data from 2010, didn't even really incorporate tablets, and now, of course, we do. One of the questions I always get asked is, okay, so you just make these numbers up, right? You ever go back and check? Are they accurate, right? I was at a conference in Brussels, and a guy from, I think it was Morgan Stanley, got up, it may have been Chase, said, well, don't believe these numbers from Cisco. They like big numbers, and they sell more routers. That'd be great, but that's not why we do it. So actually, we went back and checked. And what you can see is that based upon the forecast, and then going back and looking at what the real numbers were, we were pretty close, but we actually were conservative. The actual growth that we saw across the globe on the internet from 2005 out to 2010 actually exceeded what we had forecast. So we're pretty confident in these data. 4 things drive growth: the number of subscribers as they grow, the capabilities and speeds of the networks, the number of devices that are connected, and then the applications that drive the demand, the media-rich applications. So, in New Zealand, we're forecasting that essentially everybody, almost every man, woman, and child, will be online by 2015, up from about 3 million today. And we're forecasting that each person in New Zealand, on average, will have 3.5 devices. Right? People in this room already have more than that, I assume. Right? Just think about it. And those devices are going to be consuming traffic that is going to grow, as I mentioned, at this 40% compounded annual growth rate, right? Up to, it's going to actually, be 3 petabytes. A petabyte is 10 to the 15th, right? Huge amounts of data. Now, this is going to have implications, as I'll talk about, for the current caps, pricing models, and the ability to maintain those, which actually goes back to something that Gerd talked about, which is the sort of mindset. I mean, Gerd, you talked about content providers protecting legacy. There's another one, which is the operators, right? The telecom world was really based upon 5, and correctly, 5 essential assumptions for both business models and regulation. Number 1, the product was voice. Number 2, the metric by which you measured it, billed it, and regulated it was the minute. That's how you did everything. 3, the distance over which you talked made a difference. It changed the incremental cost. Right? How long you talked, the duration affected the incremental cost. And 5th, the location where you were affected the incremental cost. In a pure IP broadband world, none of those assumptions are correct. None. And yet, we still have the business models based upon some of that legacy, and some of it is based upon the new world, and it's about the transition from the old to the new. Right? And that's part of this parallel, the flip side, or maybe the other side of the mirror, Gerd, from the legacy models on protecting content, which you talked about, and how do we make this transition in terms of the connectivity across networks that are going to be broadband. In New Zealand, we're forecasting that the average internet user will generate about 14 gigabytes of traffic per month in 2015. That's up from an average of 1 gigabyte per month last year, or into the end of 2010. How does that compare? What is that? Is that big or small? Well, let me just give you some comparisons. In Australia, today, or I'm sorry, 2010 data, right? The average user in Australia was consuming 3 gigabytes per month, 3 times New Zealand. The US and Western Europe, the average user was consuming 14 gigabytes per month. And the forecast for the US, right? And by the way, so the forecast for New Zealand for 2015 is about 14 gigabytes. That is what was the US average user and the average household in the US was consuming 2 years ago. Right? So the growth is over 500%, but in 5 years, New Zealand will be where the US and Western Europe were 2 years ago. Right? And in the world that Gerd talked about, that's not good enough. In terms of the average household, if I can get this to, doesn't want to move. There we go. Whoop. Let me go back one. Can you go back one more? There we go. The average household in New Zealand will increase over almost 700%, from 4 gigabytes per month to 33. How does that compare? In the US and in Europe, in 2010, the average household consumption was about 48 gigabytes. And it's forecast by 2015 in the US to be about 110, in Europe about 99. So call it 100 gigabytes per month. So again, huge growth in New Zealand. But New Zealand in 2015 is forecast to not even be where the US and Europe were 2 years ago. Again, not good enough. Now, what's driving the demand globally, including here? Turns out it's video. We're forecasting that about 61% of the global traffic is going to be video. But video does not just mean traditional linear broadcast television, whether it's terrestrial or cable TV or satellite. The largest category is internet video to the PC long form, some of the things that Gerd talked about. But another very large category is short form. Short form is defined as 7 minutes or less. Why? That's YouTube. The YouTube video, right, is driving a huge amount of this demand. The fastest growing category is going to be internet video to the television. Every medium to high-end television sold this last Christmas had either a Wi-Fi or an Ethernet connection. People want to watch their video on a big screen, a large form factor. And that internet video is not necessarily linear television. And what's happening now, the question is, so who's going to create the content? That was raised in the last session. Last week, the Hollywood studios, multiple Hollywood studios, announced they are starting to create content exclusively for the internet. And that content exclusively for the internet is going to bypass the contracts of the traditional cable and satellite and broadcast providers. The studios are going to make it available directly to end users. So it's going to be a new stream of content being made available. Second, all of the current short-form video providers that are referred to sometimes as the over-the-top providers, including the YouTubes and the Facebooks, are beginning to create, if not their own content, what they're doing is they're collecting entrepreneurs, small producers, who are going to create both short-form and long-form video exclusively for the internet. That's going to be local as well as regional as well as global. And so it's going to be much more bottom-up television. Consumers become producers. So this notion of the video being controlled through contracts, which is correct, and there's this sort of, how do you move that legacy? There's an end run that's developing, which is the creation of new video content from new sources by the content providers who want to reach the consumer directly. And that is going to be very disruptive to existing contracts, but it's going to drive the demand. In New Zealand, in fact, we're forecasting that video traffic by 2015 will actually be about 81% of all internet content consumed by consumers. That's greater than in the US or Europe. And the other thing that's interesting is that, as you can see here, the consumption, the data flows for consumer are growing much faster than for business. Now, what's interesting here is that today in New Zealand, actually, consumers have a smaller portion of today's traffic, but in the future, in 2015, actually it's going to move up pretty dramatically. So there's a big catch-up by consumers driving demand here, and networks and network access and network availability are going to have to reflect that. In November, we released a new study called our Cloud Index. And the demand for cloud services is growing faster than other aspects, other consumption across the net. Why? A lot of the video that we're forecasting for the future is actually in the cloud. YouTube, for example, as well as other cloud applications. The reason that this is important, and I'm going to come back to this because it has huge implications for the type of network that we need, is that we, as part of this Cloud Index study, we looked at cloud readiness and what kind of networks are required for basic, intermediate, and advanced cloud services. And for advanced cloud services, right, networks have to have latency, a delay of less than 50 milliseconds. There are virtually no broadband networks in the world, very few. There's some very few that actually can meet that test. People tend to think of broadband as unidimensional, right? Can everybody get 2 megabits per second, 5 megabits per second, 10 megabits, 100 megabits, a gigabit? In reality, of course, broadband is multidimensional. It is download speed, but it's uploading as well, and it's latency, and it's jitter. The first three are the most critical. Having networks that are more symmetric as we move into the cloud and end users generate content and upload their video to Facebook, networks are going to have to be more symmetric so that you can do upload as well as download. And if you want to have access to advanced cloud services, low latency. You can't do low latency over copper, right? The FCC recently analyzed networks in the US. They took a look at copper versus fiber, and they found that fiber networks had latency about 50% lower than copper. Right? This has huge implications for the rollout of fiber here in New Zealand. Now, this is not just about fixed networks. It's about mobile as well. So last week, as I mentioned, we released our latest mobile visual networking index. So these data are new, and it was a forecast from 2011 to 2016. And what we're forecasting is that the global mobile data traffic, boy, that's a mouthful to say, will increase 18 times 2011 to 2016 at a growth rate of 78%. And you'll notice here, what's interesting is there's a big jump between 2015 and 2016. And in fact, that increment is 3 times greater. Just the growth from 2015 to 2016 globally is greater than 3 times all of the mobile data traffic in 2012 we're forecasting. It's a huge leap. In New Zealand, we're forecasting a 12 times growth, 64%. Right? And again, there's some issues here with caps, limits, and prices that affect that. The incremental amount of the monthly New Zealand mobile data traffic is going to be almost 2 times the forecast for 2012. But what that tells you is that it's not growing here as fast as in the rest of the world at that 15 to 2016 time period. And again, based upon some conversations here, I think that's something that we need to look at and that you need to think about as the networks are going to be able to match the demand that is a global demand. Consumers in New Zealand are no different than consumers elsewhere. The ability to do what consumers elsewhere can do, I think, is going to drive a dynamic that has to be thought about today. Mobile data traffic here more than doubled 2011 over 2010, notwithstanding the economic downturn. That's pretty significant. Now, what's driving mobile data? Video. The number of smartphones, as that grows, that you can do video. And again, it's not long-form video predominantly on the smartphone. It's going to be short-form video. It's going to be face-to-face, right? It's, you know, why does my iPhone have a camera front and back? So it's, I guess, FaceTime or whatever, right? So I can actually, that's Apple's version of Skype video. We're seeing video communications growing. We see short-form video. We see downloaded video. Video is going to drive mobile data as well. And sometimes I misspeak and I talk about mobile networks. And actually, I have no idea what that means. There's no such thing, right? I'm mobile, the network is not. Think about it, right? And that has really significant implications for the architecture of a network. The biggest trend is to take the communications off the radio as quickly as possible and put it into a fixed network. Whether it's the Wi-Fi in this room or whether we're outside, right, on a high-speed, what they call macro cell cellular network, right? It's me to the base station, and then it goes into a fixed network. And if you think about what that is going to mean, it's going to mean, in the future, fiber to every single tower and base station, right? Otherwise, it will not scale. In fact, what we have forecast is that when you begin to divide up, and I think this is what you're referring to, when you look at the various technologies of how data actually, how devices get connected to networks, by 2015, fixed Ethernet is going to be a minority of the way that the devices get connected. In the past, you had your computer, it was at your desk, you plugged it in, right? You had an Ethernet connection. And then from that, it went into a cable modem or a DSL modem or whatever. The way the device in the future will be connected, depending upon the country, by 2015, probably 50 to 60% of the way it'll be connected will be fixed Wi-Fi from the device to the network. About 8 to 10% in developed economies. It'll be over 27% in India. But in economies, countries like New Zealand, probably 8 to 9% will be mobile data on that macro network outside. And the remainder, something between 35 and 40%, will be Ethernet. And the Ethernet component is declining. But that doesn't mean, right, that there's not going to be the need to connect into an Ethernet network at some point. But this is about the device. In addition, what we see here is that in the mobile world, the consumer traffic, just like on the fixed network, is growing faster than on business. Now, this also is important. Remember I mentioned that cloud services require low latency? What we're seeing across the globe, and we're seeing here, is that the percentage of the mobile data traffic that is going to be from the cloud is going to increase. Today, it's about 40%. It's going to be 2/3 of the traffic on your mobile device is going to be residing in the cloud. Again, not surprising since video is driving that. But to that extent, latency becomes extremely important for those advanced cloud services. Offloading. Between 65 and 85% of the use of a mobile device, my iPhone, my iPad, my Android phone, my mobile device, my smartphone, my GSM plain old voice phone, right? Roughly, let's call it 70%, in some countries it's higher, is indoors sitting down. I don't need to have connectivity to an outdoor macro cell network designed for high velocity travel, right? So the biggest trend that we're seeing, or one of the biggest trends we're seeing, is offloading. Offloading is not where you decide you look for a Wi-Fi hotspot, like here, and you move it over. But rather, it's where the device and the network does it for you because it's more efficient. You know, the video communications face-to-face or FaceTime on my iPhone will not work on the 3G network. In fact, it won't even try. It will only work on Wi-Fi because it's designed for that. In the US, my iPhone is on an AT&T network contract. My iPhone automatically looks for an AT&T Wi-Fi hotspot. I go into virtually any airport in the US, and my phone automatically switches to the AT&T Wi-Fi hotspot. All of my data traffic is offloaded. My voice stays on the 3G network, but voice doesn't use very much at all in terms of data. AT&T has a contract with Starbucks. Every Starbucks in the US has an AT&T Wi-Fi hotspot. I walk into Starbucks, my iPhone automatically switches over to the AT&T network. That is offloading. It's a way to manage the network. When you take a look at this huge growth, we're going to need more spectrum for the macro network, right? And we can talk later maybe at the panel about the digital dividend and the importance of moving right, to through the digital transition and recapturing that spectrum at 700 megahertz, which is ideal for the macro networks for wireless broadband. I joke, if you want broadband, you need broadbands, big chunks of spectrum, not sliced and diced. And you need to cover large geographic areas, especially in countries like New Zealand. And the 700 megahertz is ideal for that. We did the switch off of analog in the US in 2009, almost 3 years ago. It worked. We've auctioned off the spectrum. We now have a nationwide LTE network from Verizon, and AT&T is acquiring spectrum. They're building out another one. You need that for the high-speed networks, macro networks outdoors, but you're also going to need more spectrum for the offloading when you're indoors and sitting down. And what's interesting when you take a look at the total amount of traffic, right? That is the offload plus the portable Wi-Fi. What you see is that, you know, what we're forecasting here in New Zealand is that by 2015, 27% of the mobile device traffic will be from the high-velocity macro network. About 6% will be offloading, and 67% will be to fixed Wi-Fi. Radio, right, is really important here. And by the way, if you take the 27 and 6, that's the, 18 and 82. Now, we have this thing we sort of made up called the Gigabit Club, right, in terms of mobile users, individuals. Today, end of last year, a little less than 2% of mobile users in New Zealand consumed a gigabyte a month versus about 0.5% in the world, right? So actually more consumption here. But by 2016, globally, there'll be about 60%, and here there'll be about 56%, so it's very close. But the growth rate here is going to be not quite as great. And again, this is making some assumptions about the network here, pricing, and what happens to caps. So what kind of devices are being used? What we're seeing is that smartphones are going to comprise about 45% of the devices in the future for the wireless mobile connection. That's in contrast to today. Today, laptops dominate. In the future, smartphones are going to dominate. And the nature of the smartphone, we talk about convergence of services, we talk about convergence of networks, we talk about convergence of media and telecom. We also need to take into account the convergence of the device. Right? My smartphone in the future is a computer. It's going to have a variety of form factors from iPhone small today to a tablet, but tablets are even going to be an additional 10%, and I actually think the lines between tablets and smartphones are going to blur in terms of what the form factors are. And as I said, video is going to be the driver. Video is going to be 2/3 of the traffic going across these wireless devices. An additional thing. This is the first year that we saw LTE 4G phones in use. So we had no idea what the actual data consumption was going to be. And what we found is that a 4G phone consumes 28 times more traffic than a non-4G connection, which includes GSM and 3G. Now, question, is that just early adopters? Or is it going to be everybody? And once people actually adopt, and they're not even an early adopter, are they going to reflect that consumption model? And we actually believe that they will. Because that's what's happened when people have gotten on broadband. Who said, well, I don't need broadband, but I'm going to do it because it's easier, it's always on. I don't need multi-megabit, I just do email. I'm fine with a 56 kilobit dial-up connection. What happens? Number one, they'll never go back, right? Number two, they're consuming megabits, right? No longer 56 kilobits. So we think that this is actually going to be a dramatic driver. Because what we see in the forecast is that the majority of smartphone users in the world, first of all, the majority of mobile users by 2016 will have a smartphone, even in places like India. Virtually everybody in New Zealand is going to have a smartphone. And we see by 2016 a majority of the smartphone subscribers having 4G connections. What's that going to do in terms of the demand on the need for spectrum and the need to drive the digital dividend, as well as what does that mean for the terrestrial networks, the fibers that are going to connect those base stations? So there's this question of why do you need fiber? In my mind, all roads lead to fiber. Right. High bandwidth applications, proliferation of devices, whether or not it's fixed or mobile, because of the offloading and the connections and the support. In some countries, there's a debate about, is it going to be fiber or radio? False choice. The answer is yes, both. Both. And that's going to have very significant implications for the network architecture, network investment, the development of the applications, and also the development of new business models, which raises a lot of questions. How do you get there? So one of the things that we've done is develop, we did another study as part of the Global Information Technology Report. This one was in 2009. Again, we've updated this one as well each year. And this is looking at developing a strategy on what are the roles that government can play in affecting the deployment and adoption of broadband. Right? This is a classic diffusion S-curve, right? And for something like radios or televisions, it taps out at 95 to 98% without, you don't have to do very much, right? There's no market intervention by government except you give away a lot of spectrum to radio broadcasters, right? Once you've done that, then everybody buys a radio. But you don't have to subsidize people buying TVs and radios. If this was microwave ovens and you tap out at 50%, fine, who cares? But this is not good enough if broadband is as essential as I believe, as I think you believe, otherwise you wouldn't be here, for all of the social purpose applications. So how do you move that needle? Right? There was a question earlier about national broadband plans or subsidies or reaching out to the rural areas and so on. We can talk about that, right, in terms of how you do that. But government has had a role as a catalyst. Market stimulation, pre-commercial research and development. The U.S. Defense Department actually funding the work that it led to the invention of the internet, right? Perfect role. Governments have played that for years. But it seems to me that there's another place that if you have an adoption curve that because there's insufficient supply or reach or demand, but something is seen as a national purpose, right? Ubiquitous electricity, clean water, transportation. Those are the three classic essential infrastructures needed for economic development, right? And I believe that the fourth essential infrastructure is broadband connectivity. So if that's the case, what do you do? And what can government do? Well, first, government can affect the supply. That's the reach, right? Getting the broadband networks out there. And then second, there's working on some of the demand issues. And we can talk about those. And then you can actually get this adoption curve up to 95%. That's the adoption curve. So one of the things that we've done is we've built out a framework with keystones for a network strategy. And I'm not going to go into details in these, but the first one is really about policies and regulation. Has the institutional framework evolved from the traditional fixed telephony based upon those 5 assumptions that I spoke of earlier to this converged world that Gerd talked about, in which everything is over internet protocol, everything's over IP, with easy entry and exits and everything else? Second, what's the market structure? Is there competition? Competition really drives everything. Right? We've seen that globally in broadband. We know that where there's competition, there is more investment and there is greater adoption. Now, there are places where what you want to do, especially in rural areas, low-density areas, the NBN in Australia is an example of that, and some of the work being done here with Crown Fiber is share the passive infrastructure, especially in low-density areas, to lower the cost of the CapEx, and then let there be competition among the active elements to drive technology, product, and service differentiation that's going to drive demand and drive new business models. Public-private partnerships for investment, some of the things I just mentioned. Government as an anchor tenant. Governments are the biggest users of ICT in most countries, at the national and local level. Smart government use of its funds actually can drive demand and drive build-out. If you can take OpEx and turn it into CapEx, right? How? Well, if the government's going to have a 10-year contract to buy connectivity, pay the 10 years over 3 years. Fund build-out. I mean, there's some very creative things that can be done. Skills for ICT are extremely important, as are applications and content and new forms of content. And that gets to some of the things that Gerd talked about. So in terms of filling these gaps, we've actually identified 14 different action areas where government actually can play a role, sometimes as an enabler, sometimes as a convener, sometimes, but not, actually it's a very small part, as a regulator. When I say government involvement, that doesn't mean regulation. There are a lot of dials that governments can turn to affect private investment, and so that the private sector can and will do, because the private sector always has done the largest portion of the investment across this entire ecosystem. Start where the impact is high and it's feasible. Don't pick things that are really hard or not possible locally, politically, and that changes country to country. And there's also a role for some local governments in terms of demand creation, or even things like making it easier for the construction of local build-out, right? In some countries, that's a much bigger deal than here. In the US, we have 50 states plus the District of Columbia regulating telephone companies separately, and each city grants a cable TV franchise. There are over 30,000 local jurisdictions in the US. cable franchising is a nightmare, right? So there's some things that can be done at the local level as well, which may not apply as much here. But there are 14 different things that actually government can do in analyzing that, and we can talk about that. And you put all of that together and you have a national strategy. Some of it's national, some of it's local. So summary implications and questions. First, consumers are driving the exploding demand, and that's being driven by video of all types, not just traditional television. Second, the networks need to support multiple concurrent video applications. You know, unless you're living alone in a cave, right, there's more video going on in your household, especially families, and it's not all the same kind of video. So, you know, when my son is gaming, right, and I'm watching, you know, a long-form video, and my wife is watching YouTube videos because she's clicking through, right? Gerd made a point about newspapers becoming television, right? The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal actually these days, you know, I mean, they started within the last several months, right? They actually have live, real-time streaming television every morning going through their headlines on their website. So we combine all of these things together. I have multiple video connections in my home simultaneously, and the network needs to support that. Applications are requiring symmetrical access bit rates, and that's only going to increase. Applications increasingly are in the cloud, and that is going to require low latency. And as the cloud-based applications are being used at home, people are going to demand the same kind of latency in networks that they have at work. Or if you're a professor teaching, right? Somebody asked that question. The professor at the university. So the expectation of network performance from work is going to come to the home in terms of bandwidth, speed, symmetry, and low latency. We can't collaborate on documents together using Google Docs if I'm typing and you're typing, and by the way, there's so much latency, the changes don't appear in sync. It won't work, people won't use it. So the expectation is for low latency. It's taking those corporate LAN requirements and putting them in the home. This is about mobile as well as fixed. New Zealand, mobile is being driven by video and cloud services like elsewhere in the world. All roads lead to fiber. And then the question is, how do we increase the demand for social purpose applications? Because, you know, the consumer cares about the video. A lot of this, frankly, is going to be entertainment driven. But we all know that a lot of the economic and social benefits are in education, healthcare, the provision of government services, better citizen services, increasing citizenship and participation, closing those gaps, right? It's not clear how we get to that point. And that's, to me, one of the real questions. And that's what we're going to be discussing both today but also tomorrow, David. So that's what I have.
Excellent.
And thank you very much.